Hello, and thank you for watching this state-by-state full perspective look at the SARS-CoV-2 virus, commonly known as COVID-19. We will be covering every state individually, so please fast forward to your state to get all the details. These graphs assume that each count represents a unique individual. This is not the case in reality, so these would be worst-case pictures. People say, what do you mean by that? The numbers do not separate those who went to be tested multiple times. So if two people go for testing, but one of those two tests twice, that would equal 3 tests. Since we can't see that information, we are assuming if we had a population of 6 people, it would show that 50% of the population was tested, when in reality, there were only 2 people tested. Also, keep in mind, according to the CDC website, this would also include presumed positives. For example, you live with someone who tested positive, but you were not tested. You would count as a presumed positive. So now we have 2 people who go to get tested. One of those people gets 2 tests. One was a positive, one was a negative to show that they didn't have it anymore. That one person lives with 3 people. So now we would have a total of 6 tests, 4 positives and 2 negatives. Fuzzy math, we know. So 2 people went to get tested and now we've got 4 positives and 2 negatives. Thus, we are most likely looking at the worst case scenario representation of the data. There is a lot of data on these graphs, so let's go over what we are looking at. The pie circle is the breakdown of vaccinations. Red is equal to the number of people vaccinated, or the percentage of people. Blue are the people that have not been vaccinated. This is calculated by taking the population minus the number vaccinated. The donut circle is the breakdown of testing. Blue is equal to the negative test results. White is assuming that each test represented one person, so we're calculating the population minus the total tests done. And red, well, this is the piece of data that has been being used to make opening and closing policies across the United States. These represent the number of positive test results, which are reported as the number of cases. We take the data from this red piece of the pie and show how it breaks out on the column on the left side. So the red represents the number of people who have died. Remember, that number also represents people who either died from or died with. Blue is equal to the current people in the hospital at this time. And white are the people that are not hospitalized and haven't died. It's all the other positive tests. Not all states report recovery, so we just grouped all the rest here. Let's look at the U.S. as a whole. So the number vaccinated is 7.6%. That's how many have been vaccinated in the entire United States. If every test was one individual, we would be able to say that 21.3% of the United States has not been tested. So that's saying 80% of the people have taken a test. 70.8% received a negative result, and 7.9% are positives. Now, remember, these positives are made up of both positive test results and presumed positives, as well as people taking more than one test. This 7.9% number is what we have been using to drive the narrative for SARS-CoV-2. So let's go over here to the left and see what that piece looks like when it's broken down. We can see the red section here are those who have died, a little over 432,000 people. That number includes both people who died from COVID and with COVID. Right now, there are a little over 95,000 people in the hospital. This gives you a good visualization of what COVID looks like as an overall in the United States. You can also see the number of hospital beds we have in the U.S. Although there are areas which are putting a strain on their bed capacity, in general, the U.S. as a whole is pretty open. Let's also point out the population compared to these numbers up here. So out of this number, the population, 7.9% tested positive, that's the little red piece of the pie. And out of the red piece of the pie, this red section represents the number who died from or with SARS-CoV-2 in their system. Also notice, the number vaccinated is just under the number who tested positive. So let's look at a few quick things to look at to get some perspective. The outer pie ring is a representation of the total population. Notice the size of the red piece in comparison to the whole pie. The red section is a high representation of the number of people who tested positive. Now notice the red section of the column in comparison to the rest of the column. Or better yet, notice how much of the column is white. Remember, this column is a breakdown of what is included in just that red piece of the pie. So the red and blue sections are tiny slivers of the entire pie. Let's take a look at the rest of the states. Here's a look at Alaska. They vaccinated 79% of their population. That's like really high compared to everybody else. Of the population, they had 20% negative tests and 7.2% positive tests. They had 262 people die, and right now there's 42 people in the hospital with over 1,200 hospital beds available. It really is interesting that a state that had only 262 people die out of 731,000 has gotten over 79% of their population vaccinated. Alabama, they vaccinated 6.2% of their population. They had a total of 36% negative and 9.4% positive. They had over 7,600 people die. There are over 1,800 people in the hospital right now, but they have about 15,000 beds. For Arkansas, they vaccinated 8.3% of their population. They've had 72.8% negative and 9.8% positive. They had over 4,800 people die, and there's over 900 people in the hospital with 7,900 hospital beds. Arizona, they vaccinated 7.2% of their people. They've had a negative test of about 37%, positive test rate at 10.4%. The 10% numbers are high. Most of them are in the 7% range, so 10.4% is a little high. They had 13,000 people die and 3,600 people in the hospital right now with over 13,000 beds. California, they had some of the strictest lockdowns and are just now starting to open up. Although in comparison to the other states, their percentages are within the same range. They vaccinated 7.2% of their population. And notice, if each test represented one person, California would have tested every person in their state. In doing so, they turned out a negative rate of 92.3%. Their positive rate is at 7.7%. They had over 40,000 people die. Now you have to keep this population number in mind when you're looking at that high number of people who died. Their hospitalizations right now is over 15,000 people with 74,000 beds. In Colorado, they vaccinated 7.9% of their people. Their negative test rate was about 34.9% with a positive test rate of 6.9%. They've had over 5,600 people die. There's 652 in the hospital right now with over 8,000 hospital beds. In Connecticut, they vaccinated 10% of their people. 10% is kind of high in comparison to everyone else. Again, if each test represented one person, they would have tested every person in their state. They ended up with a negative test rate of 95.6, a positive test rate of 4.4, 7,000 people died, 900 people hospitalized, and 8,700 hospital beds. In DC, they've only vaccinated 7% of their people, which I think is funny because they're the ones driving all of these tests. They'd only have 7% right there in DC. And yes, here we are again, the total number of tests equals to the population. Their negative test results so far have been 96.6%, with 3.4% testing positive. 913 people have died, 251 in the hospital with 2,100 beds. Delaware, they vaccinated 8.7% of their population. Their negative tests have been in the 52.2% range. Their positive test is at 8%. They've had a little over 1,000 people die, 315 in the hospital with over 2,000 beds. Florida was one of the states that did not have extreme lockdowns. They did for a little bit and then they opened up. They also had spring break, the major theme parks, the older population, and vacationers. They vaccinated 7.8% of their population. Their negative tests are at 39.4% with a positive rate of 7.9%. We would have expected that to be a little higher, given the circumstances of Florida. They've had 26,000 people die, with 6,100 in the hospital, 56,000 hospital beds. Now keep in mind, again, 26,000 people sounds like a lot of people, and it is, especially if you have one that passed away from your household. But in the big picture of things, with their population, that's not a huge number. In Georgia, they vaccinated 7.4% of their population, the negative tests at 53%, positive tests at 7%, 14,000 people died, 4,400 in the hospital, and 22,000 hospital beds. Hawaii had 7.4% vaccinated, 67.9% of the population showed as negative, 30% positive test, 410 people died, 73 hospitalized, and 2,500 hospital beds. Iowa vaccinated 6.1% of the population, 31% negative tests, 8.5% positive tests, 4,900 people died, 358 in the hospital right now with 6,400 hospital beds. In Idaho, we vaccinated 6.1% of the population. We have a 26% negative, 9.1 positive tests, 1,700 died, 225 in the hospital, 2,400 in hospital beds. Illinois is still on a lockdown in some areas. They're trying to open that up. They vaccinated 6.4% of the population. This is another state that pretty much tested their entire population. They have a 93% negative rate with a 7% positive rate. 21,000 people died, 2,400 hospitalized with 28,000 beds. Indiana, they vaccinated 6.4% with the negative test results at 34.6%. Their positive test is at 9.3%. They've had 9,900 people die, 1,500 people are hospitalized right now with 15,000 beds. Kansas, they vaccinated 6.3% of the population. They have a 30.7 negative test rating, a 9.4% positive test. 3,700 died, 550 in the hospital right now with 6,400 beds. Kentucky vaccinated 7.8%. Their negative tests are at 72.2%, with the positive tests at 8.1%. They've had 3,700 people die, 1,300 hospitalized right now, 13,000 beds available. Louisiana tested near their entire population. They vaccinated 8.1%, and their negative tests are at 92%. Their positive tests are only at 8%. They've had 8,800 people die, 1,400 people hospitalized right now, 14,000 hospital beds. Massachusetts, they vaccinated 8.1% of the population. They've had a 59.4% negative test. Their positive tests are at 7.6%. They've had over 14,000 people die. 1,600 are hospitalized right now, and over 15,000 beds. Maryland vaccinated 7.3%. Their negative test 47%. Their positive tests are at 5.9%. They've had 7,100 people die, 1,400 people hospitalized right now, with over 10,000 beds. In Maine, they tested near their entire population. They vaccinated 8.2%. Their negative test percentage is at 97%. Their positive tests are almost 3%. They've had 590 people die. They've hospitalized 160 currently, and 2,800 hospital beds. Michigan vaccinated 8%. Their negative tests are at 87.7%. Their positive tests are at 6.1%. They've had over 15,000 people die, 1,400 in a hospital right now, and over 23,000 beds available. Minnesota, they vaccinated 7.5% of their population. Their negative tests are at about 50%, which is kind of an odd number in comparison to everybody else. Their positive test rates at 8.2%. They had 6,200 people die, 420 are hospitalized right now, and they have over 10,000 beds. Missouri, their testing rate was pretty low. They vaccinated 5.8%. Their negative tests is 28.9%. Their positive test rates are 7.5%. 6,700 died, 1,900 in the hospital, 16,000 hospital beds. Mississippi, they vaccinated 5.8%. Their negative test 43.5%. They have a positive test at 9.2%. They've had 6,000 people die, 953 in the hospital right now, and over 10,000 hospital beds. Montana vaccinated 7.5%. They have a negative test at 80.7%, positive tests at 8.8%. They've had over 1,200 people die, 100 some people in the hospital right now, and they have 2,200 hospital beds. North Carolina vaccinated 7.8% of their population. They've had a 78.1% negative, 7.2 positive test results. 9,300 people died, 2,700 are hospitalized, and over 22,000 hospital beds. North Dakota, they vaccinated 9.4% of the population. Their negative tests are at 38.9%. Their positive tests are at 12.8%. And I might be mistaken, but I think they're one of the highest in positive tests, not in number of test results, but their percentage turning up positive. Over 1,400 people died, 50 were hospitalized right now, and over 2,000 hospital beds. Nebraska vaccinated 6.9% of their population. Their negative tests were 37.9% compared to 9.9% positive tests. 1,900 people died, 320 have hospitalized right now, and 4,200 hospital beds available. New Hampshire had vaccinated 7.4% of their population. Their negative tests are sitting at 40.6%, positive tests 4.8%. Over 1,000 people have died, 200 are hospitalized, and there's about 2,200 and some beds. New Jersey tested near all their population. They vaccinated 7.7%. The negative test was 92.6%. Their positive tests are at 7.4%. They've had over 21,000 people die. 2,900 are in the hospital right now, and there's about 20,000 hospital beds. New Mexico tested near their entire population. They vaccinated 10.1%. Their negative tests are at 92.6%, positive tests are 7.4%, 3,200 people died, 479 hospitalized, and over 3,800 beds. Nevada vaccinated 6.9% of the population. Their negative tests were 34.2%. Their positive tests are at 9%. 4,200 people have died, 1,200 people are hospitalized, and they have 58,000 hospital beds. New York, they tested most of their populations, and if you remember, New York had a lot of lockdowns. They were pretty strict. They vaccinated 7.8% of their population. They have 95.6% testing negative and 4.4% testing positive. They had 35,000 deaths, 7,900 people are in the hospital right now, and 57,000 hospital beds. Again, we do have to look at the population. Those numbers still sound pretty high. Ohio vaccinated 7.1% of the population. They have 70% negative, 7.7 positive. 11,000 people died, 2,400 in the hospital, 27,000 hospital beds. Oklahoma vaccinated 9.1% with the negative test 70.6%. 9.8 positive test, 3,500 died, 1,100 hospitalized, and 38,000 hospital beds. Oregon vaccinated 8.1% of their population. Their negative tests are at 71.6% with positive to 3.4%. 1,900 people died, 320 in the hospital, and 6,100 hospital beds. Pennsylvania, the number of people that they tested has been pretty low. They vaccinated 7%. Their negative tests are 28.4%. Their positive tests were 6.6%. They had 21,000 people die. 3,370 are hospitalized right now with 34,000 hospital beds available. Rhode Island vaccinated 6.5% of their population. Their negative tests are at 59.9%. Their positive tests are at 10.8%. They had 2,100 people die, 324 hospitalized, and they had 2,400 hospital beds. South Carolina vaccinated 7.4% of their population. Their negative tests are 73.5%. Positives at 8.6%. 7,000 people died, 1,800 people hospitalized, and 11,000 hospital beds. South Dakota pretty much stayed open the entire time. They vaccinated 8.7% of their people. Their negative tests are at 33.3%. Their positive tests are at 12.2%. It's interesting because that's a low negative and a high positive. 1,700 people died, 125 have hospitalized, and they have 2,700 hospital beds. That's in comparison to other states, not necessarily for their state. Tennessee came close to testing their entire population. They vaccinated 6.5%. Their negative tests are at 83.6%. Positive tests were 10.7%. They had 9,600 people die. 1,600 are in the hospital right now with 18,000 hospital beds. Texas vaccinated 6.9% of their population. Their negatives are around 51.9% with a positive test of 8.1%. 36,000 people died, 11,000 are hospitalized right now with 58,000 hospital beds. Utah vaccinated 7.6%. Their negative tests are sitting at about 44.8%, 10.8% of the positive test results. They have 1,600 who died, 519 hospitalized right now with 4,600 hospital beds. Virginia vaccinated 8.1% of their population. Their negative test percentage is at 55.4% with a 5.9% positive tests. They have 6,400 people who died, 2,500 hospitalized, 17,000 hospital beds. Vermont vaccinated 8.6% of their population. Their negative tests are at 46.8% with positive tests at 1.9%. 174 people died, 68 were hospitalized, 835 hospital beds. Washington vaccinated 7.6% of their population. Their negative tests are at 55.6%, positives at 4.1%. 4,200 people died, 797 are hospitalized, with 10,000 hospital beds. Wisconsin vaccinated 7.4% of the population. Their negative tests are at 43.1%, positive tests at 10.2%. 6,400 people died, 680 are hospitalized, 11,000 hospital beds. West Virginia. They tested near their entire population. They vaccinated 10.8% of their population. Their negative tests are at 93.8%, positives at 6.2%. They had 2,000 people died, 456 were hospitalized, and 5,300 hospital beds. Wyoming vaccinated 8.3% of their population, 29.8% negative, 9% positive, 596 died, 54 hospitalized, and 1,200 hospital beds. We hope this helps put things into perspective and provides you with a good visual representation of SARS-CoV-2. Subscribe and hit that like button. Thank you.